The rain poured mercilessly, drumming against the roof as thunder rumbled in the distance. The police officer standing at the door removed his cap, his face pale with sorrow.
"I'm sorry, Miss Amara,
He said gently.
but your parents didn't make it."
Amara's heart stopped.
No, this had to be a mistake.
She stared at the officer, her mind spinning. Just that morning, her mother had kissed her forehead and told her to be good. Her father had promised they would go out for ice cream when they returned. Now they were gone. She wanted to scream, to shake the officer and demand that he takes back his words, but all she could do was sink to the floor, her body trembling as grief swallowed her whole. The days that followed were a blur. Strangers murmured condolences. Black-clad figures moved in and out of her home, whispering about her future. Where would she go? Who would take her in? Then Aunt Linda stepped forward.
"She will stay with me.
She declared.
She is my blood."
Amara clung to those words like a lifeline. Perhaps, just perhaps, she could still find love and safety in her aunt's home. The first few weeks in Aunt Linda's house were tolerable. The house was small but warm, with walls painted a soft cream and the scent of spices always lingering in the air. Aunt Linda worked long hours, leaving early in the morning and returning late at night. She wasn't affectionate, but she provided food and shelter, and that was enough for Amara. Then she met him, Mr. Gerald. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with piercing eyes that always seemed to linger on her a little too long. At first, she ignored it. He was her aunt's husband after all. Surely, he was just being observant. But then came the touches, light, seemingly accidental brushes of his fingers against her skin. The way he stood too close. The strange, sickening smiles. Amara's stomach twisted whenever she was alone with him. One night, Aunt Linda had to travel for work. Amara was left alone with Mr. Gerald. She tried to keep to herself, staying locked in her small room, but late into the night, she heard his footsteps outside her door. Then a knock. Her hands clenched into fists. She didn't answer. Another knock.
"Amara,
His voice was slow, deliberate.
open the door."
She shut her eyes tightly. Maybe if she ignored him, he would go away. But then the handle turned. Her heart slammed against her chest as she realized the door wasn't locked. The door creaked open, and the darkness of the hallway swallowed her whole. That was the night her nightmare began. Mr. Gerald was a monster. Whenever Aunt Linda left the house, Amara lived in terror. He would grab her wrist too tightly, whisper threats in her ear, and hurt her in ways she could never describe. She wanted to tell Aunt Linda. She tried once. One morning, as her aunt prepared breakfast, Amara stood by the kitchen counter, her lips trembling.
Auntie,
She hesitated, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. Aunt Linda turned, stirring a pot of porridge.
"What is it, Amara?"
Just as she was about to speak, she felt a shadow behind her. Mr. Gerald. His fingers brushed the back of her neck lightly, a silent warning.
"Nothing,"
She whispered, her voice barely audible. That night, she paid for her almost confession.
"You ever tell her,
Mr. Gerald hissed, his fingers tightening around her arm.
and I'll kill you. You and that bastard in your belly."
Amara froze. She hadn't even realized yet, but it was true. She was pregnant, with a child of the man who had destroyed her. Weeks passed, and her stomach began to swell. She tried to hide it, but Aunt Linda was not a fool. One evening, as Amara washed dishes, her aunt's voice sliced through the air.
Amara.
She turned, her breath caught in her throat. Her aunt's eyes, sharp and accusing, roamed over her body, stopping at the unmistakable curve of her belly.
Who is the father?
Amara felt the blood drain from her face. She couldn't say. She couldn't speak. Her lips trembled, but no words came out.
Answer me.
Aunt Linda shouted, slamming a hand on the table.
I can't.
Amara stammered. That was the wrong answer. Aunt Linda's face twisted in disgust.
You shameless girl. You bring disgrace into my home and refuse to even name the father?
Tears welled in Amara's eyes. She wanted to scream the truth, to beg her aunt to protect her. But Mr. Gerald stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching. And she was too afraid.
Get out.
Aunt Linda's voice was cold, final.
Auntie, please.
Amara whispered.
I said get out.
She had no choice. With nothing but a bag of clothes and a heart filled with fear, Amara stepped out into the cold, unforgiving night. Homeless, alone, pregnant, and for the first time in her life, truly abandoned. The night swallowed Amara whole. She walked aimlessly through the streets, the wind biting through her thin clothes. The city was alive. Cars sped by, laughter echoed from a nearby bar, neon lights flickered in the distance. But Amara felt like a ghost, unseen, unheard. Her feet ached. Her stomach growled. The baby inside her stirred, as if sensing the fear and exhaustion washing over her. She had nowhere to go. She had no one. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she wrapped her arms around herself, whispering to the life growing within her.
I'm sorry.
She choked.
I don't know how to protect you.
As if in response, the baby kicked. A reminder that she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She found an old, abandoned building, half-constructed, with crumbling walls and exposed bricks. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. She curled up in a corner, shivering against the night's cold. For the first time, she allowed herself to sob. The days blurred into weeks. Amara begged on the streets, her swollen belly making it harder to move. Some people gave her food, others scoffed at her, muttering about reckless girls who had ruined their lives. She tried to work, but no one wanted to hire a pregnant girl with no experience. Hunger gnawed at her. Some nights, she went to sleep with nothing but water in her stomach. One night, the hunger became unbearable. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. She sat outside a small restaurant, breathing in the scent of sizzling meat and fresh bread. She watched as a man left his plate half-finished and walked away. Her pride screamed at her to stay still, but her body acted on its own. She darted forward, snatching a piece of bread from his plate and shoving it into her mouth. The restaurant owner saw her.
Thief.
He shouted, grabbing her by the wrist. Amara gasped, struggling against his grip.
Please.
She begged.
I'm starving.
His expression hardened.
Not my problem.
Before he could drag her away, a kind-looking woman intervened.
Let her go.
She stole from my restaurant.
The woman dug into her purse, pulled out a few bills, and handed them over.
This should cover it.
The man huffed but let Amara go. The woman turned to her, eyes filled with sympathy.
Where's your family?
Gone.
She couldn't say it aloud. The woman sighed.
Come with me.
For a brief moment, Amara thought she had finally found safety. But by morning, the woman was gone, leaving nothing behind but a few coins and a blanket. Amara realized something that day. No one was coming to save her. Months passed. The cold nights grew warmer, but Amara's struggles only worsened. Her belly was huge now, making every step difficult. Then, one night, as she lay on a piece of cardboard in an abandoned shop, a sharp pain shot through her stomach. She gasped, clutching her belly. The pain came again, stronger this time. She was going into labor. Panic seized her. She had no hospital, no doctor, no one to hold her hand. She crawled toward the street, hoping anyone would help.
I was just a shadow, fading in the night, carrying my sorrow, too tired to fight. Every tear that fell, every whispered lie told me I was nothing, left me wondering why. But even when the world tried to break me down, I found a fire, it's burning now.
But the city moved on uncaring. Hours passed. The pain became unbearable. She screamed into the empty night, tears blurring her vision. Then one final push. And silence. For a terrifying second, there was no sound. Then a cry. A tiny, desperate, beautiful cry. Amara sobbed as she lifted the baby into her arms. A girl. Her little girl. She was covered in blood and weak from exhaustion, but none of that mattered. She had won. She had brought life into a world that had tried to destroy her. Tears of joy and pain mixed on her face as she whispered,
Zara. Your name is Zara.
and for the first time in a long time, she smiled. While Amara struggled, Aunt Linda's life was far from perfect. Her home was silent. Too silent. She and Mr. Gerald had tried for a baby for years, but nothing. She visited doctor after doctor, swallowing bitter pills, undergoing painful procedures, but still nothing. The irony clawed at her. She had thrown out her own niece, pregnant, abandoned, desperate, only to find herself barren. One day, she overheard neighbors whispering,
Did you hear? That girl Linda threw out, she had her baby on the streets.
Aunt Linda's fingers tightened around her teacup. She forced herself to ignore it, to ignore the guilt gnawing at her, to ignore the feeling that maybe, just maybe, she had made the worst mistake of her life. Amara and Zara became inseparable. The world was still cruel, but Amara fought harder. She found small jobs, washing clothes, cleaning houses, even selling bottled water on the streets. Every penny went toward feeding Zara. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every missed meal was for her daughter. She was no longer just a girl struggling to survive. She was a mother, and she would never let Zara suffer the way she had. She had lost everything, but in Zara, she had gained something worth more than the world. And so, despite the hardships, despite the pain, she kept going. For Zara. For love. For the future. The sun burned mercilessly overhead as Amara walked through the bustling streets, balancing a tray of bottled water on her head. Zara, now 5 years old, skipped beside her, her tiny fingers clutching the edge of her mother's tattered dress.
Mama, I'm hungry.
The little girl whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the market. Amara's heart clenched. She had only managed to sell a few bottles that day, barely enough to buy a small loaf of bread. She smiled weakly and bent down to stroke Zara's cheek.
We'll eat soon, my love.
She assured her. Zara nodded, trusting her mother completely. That trust made Amara's chest tighten. The little girl deserved the world, but all she could give her was an incomplete shelter, barely enough food, and a life of struggle. She had failed her.
No.
She couldn't think that way. She had survived this long, and she would keep fighting. For Zara. For their future. That afternoon, as they made their way home, Zara's laughter rang through the air. She was always finding joy in the smallest things, a butterfly, a stray puppy, even the way the wind blew through her tangled curls.
Mama, look. I can run so fast.
She shouted, giggling as she sprinted ahead.
Zara, not too far!
Amara called after her. But before she could take another step, she heard it, the screech of tires, the blaring of a horn, and then a sickening thud. Time seemed to freeze.
Zara!
Amara's heart nearly exploded from her chest as she dropped her tray and ran. Zara's small body lay on the ground, unmoving, beside a sleek black car. The driver, a tall man in a crisp white shirt, had already stepped out, his face filled with shock.
Oh my God!
He murmured.
Is she okay?
Amara fell to her knees, hands shaking as she touched her daughter's face.
Zara.
She whispered, voice breaking. The little girl groaned softly, her eyelids fluttering. She was breathing. She was alive. Tears spilled down Amara's cheeks as relief crashed over her.
I didn't see her.
The man said, his voice laced with guilt.
Please, let me take her to the hospital.
Amara hesitated. She didn't trust strangers. She didn't trust rich men in expensive cars. But this was Zara. And Zara needed help. So, swallowing her pride, she nodded.